Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SB Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Leo moon as the luminary out of Sect, I speak with my friend Taalumot. I'm actually feeling a bit under the weather today, so I'm not going to share a long intro, but I did want to share 3 things. The first is that I'm running a sale on my natal and timing consultations for this month, the month of August. So please use coupon code AUG23 for 15% off your purchase. Second, Tal talks about his electional practice and launching his electional practice in this conversation. So Tal has launched that. And he's continuing to answer horary questions as well. So please visit his website, which is linked in the show notes, for more information on that. And third, follow Tal on Instagram. He is sharing really cool, awesome pictures of the moon on there. And so I don't want any of you to miss that, you moonheads. So go give him a follow there. That's it, y'all. I hope everybody is having a good end to your Leo season. I hope that the Venus retrograde hasn't been too hard on y'all. And that's it. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right. Taalumot, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing just great. It's always a new adventure in my house, and today is no exception.
Amazing. What's the adventure today, if you don't mind?
Well, I had to take the compost out. It was getting pretty full. That's a chicken feeding job as much as it is a gardening job. And it was real hot out there when I went out to do that this morning. So I'm still sort of recovering from that experience. And like just the contrast between doing stuff in the yard when it's a million degrees outside and then coming in and doing computer stuff in the cool, dark room where I do that it's like bewildering, but
yeah,
so is everything.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting astrological concept that we don't have to get super into, but something I've been thinking about recently. Interested if you have thoughts, especially with all your Leo placements. But for those who are listening, it's July 12th right now. It's about 12:15 p.m. LA time. I'm located in LA. I'll let Tal say where they're located if he wants to. But we're starting to get into like the malefic sun season, I feel like, and it's interesting thinking about astrology being something kind of grounded in a certain geography or geographies, and how that can kind of how we can think about the sun as kind of malefic, overwhelming. We're still in Cancer season, but like here in LA, like I just went for a walk. I had to change my shirt before we recorded because I didn't want to be on screen. Like, hey, Tal, what's up? Like I'm covered in sweat, So I just think that that's really, really interesting. Interested if you have any thoughts on it.
I'm so there with you. I mean, I'm a Leo sun also. I have a late summer birthday. I'm located in the southeastern United States, where the sun is highly malefic in the summertime. And I was born in the late afternoon. I have an 8th house sun. And so like the sun, therefore I am a Capricorn rising Saturnian person. And so I prefer the cold and dark, and the sun is like a death creature in the sky at the moment of my birth, and that is certainly how I relate to it at this time of year. But of course, from the other end, it's the savior of the universe. So
right, we don't have
life
all
without the cycles.
Yep. Right, absolutely. Very cool. Yeah, and we will get more into that. That's you're bringing up interesting thoughts already within me. But I do want to ask you a little bit too about how the transits are going right now. You just had your Mars return, and you're also having Venus going through, about to retrograde in that Leo house. So how are things coming up?
Man, I have a really crazy summer astrologically. Everybody does, but those big ones are really hitting me hard. I mean, Venus is stationing right off of my natal Venus, let alone it's like almost there, and then it's stopping and turning around. And then the direct station is on the degree of the moon that we're here to talk about. So, or maybe it's like 1 degree past. So this is like a real trip for me. And it is already showing up in terms of relationships and revisiting like old themes that have come up. And it's just getting started too. So I'm looking forward to a very exciting summer of life-changing developments.
Yeah. I will just say really quickly, I have it in my ninth. Leo is my ninth house, whole sign house. And I'm traveling. I live in LA. I'm traveling back to New York, where I was born and grew up, for the first time since 2017.
Wow.
And it seems like every time Venus goes retrograde in my ninth house, I either move state, travel across state. Like it really reconfigures my life. And I'm also already seeing it very strongly. And so it's very interesting to see how it will go, given how loud it's been thus far.
The thing I forgot to mention is that the last time there was a Venus retrograde in Leo, which is before I was keeping track of that sort of thing. My wife and I got engaged. Around the time that it turned retrograde. So, that'll be a thing. 8th house Venus retrograde and stuff about relationships definitely going to come up.
Merged resources, like, for sure. That's interesting. Awesome. Tal, can you give us a brief, or not so brief if you don't want, introduction to yourself, your practice, perhaps your philosophical orientation to astrology, life, whatever you feel like sharing?
Absolutely. I might wait a second because my daughter Lila is outside my door crying.
Okay. If you got to attend to that, do what you
No, I don't have to attend, but I certainly don't want to be recorded podcasting while my daughter cries. Maybe this is actually usable material. My children are both Venus ruled. My eldest is a Libra rising. My youngest is a Taurus rising. That's the one crying right now. And, the natal Venus in Leo is like really deeply associated. And Taurus is my 5th house also. So it's, it's like all there. Like my children are going to be Venus matters. And so, this is also, I mentioned relationship stuff in terms of this summer's astrology, but it's also very much about them and their, changing. They're 4 and 2, and so like they're both in sort of critical developmental stages, changing all the time. And I am sort of excited to see what their first like big Venus retrograde that roots in my chart like this is going to be like. Sounds like things are under control over there, so I'll get back to the question now. I am a Jewish person of European descent with an initiation in a American Soto Zen lineage, and have been practicing in the Soto Zen tradition for like 15 years, starting in college, and have a teacher here who I sit with every week, and am an active member of a Zen center. So that's sort of my my sort of main personal spiritual training, though of course I have also received much spiritual training from my Jewish upbringing. I'm married to a rabbi, and we have a very Jewish household, and also just a very sort of spiritually active household in general.
Beautiful.
My role is the weird one. My wife is the sort of rational, practical rabbinic figure, guiding people in a very sort of above board religious clergy person way, and I am doing like there's always weird smoke and flickering candles and coming out from the crack under my door, and I am doing all kinds of astrology and divination and stuff in here. But to me, it's all of a piece. Of course, there are 3. I really do sort of claim these 3 things as not separate, but distinguishable lineages for me. But I can't really talk about any one of them without getting into the other 3. So between the Judaism, the Zen, and the divination, those are sort of my traditions,
the pillars that hold up Tal's life.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of building on top of all 3 of them whenever I get to it.
Mm-hmm.
Astrology is the one I'm arguably building the most these days. There are, sort of teachers and figures and names and lineages to mention there, but I sort of owe it all. This isn't the very beginning of my history with astrology, and like some of the things that I think we're going to talk about later will get deeper into how this all came up and why I was ready for this in the first place. But in sort of the formal, overt study of astrology, I kind of owe it all to our friend Taalumot from the internet, who goes by the name Taalumot.
It was on the previous episode.
Oh, great. So that's where I was introduced to all of this through his work and writing, but also just like conversations about astrology and what it can do for you as a spiritual practitioner. And through Sood, which is what I call him, I met Hawk, who became just an internet friend at first, but responded very quickly and favorably to stuff I was talking about wanting to study astrology and divination in general in the student-teacher model that I was used to from the Zen tradition, and really is sort of familiar from like rabbinic Judaism also, because I felt like I needed that personal initiation of a more experienced person, and Hawk stepped up to do that. And so we met together privately for about 6 months, just to learn, like I was familiar enough with the like Google search level significations of planets and signs, but I didn't really know how the system fit together, and nor did I really know sort of what is a sign, what is a planet, like spiritually speaking, what are these beings and places, and how do we interact with them. That was the sort of thing that Hawk taught me, as well as some fairly important foundational technical stuff, particularly relating to aspects and just sort of the shape of charts, the essential dignity scheme, and rulerships, and how those things lend their meanings to these technical details, and how it's not really just about memorizing lists, it's more about understanding relationships. Hawk taught me all of that. So Hawk is a student of the teacher we now know as Adam Ellenbos, formerly known as Achyuta Bhava Das, which was his name when they studied together. And there was a sort of long running thread within my conversations with some of my astrology friends that horary would speak to me if I would learn to do it. And around the time Hawk and I were wrapping up, Adam's year-long horary course was getting started. And so I decided this felt like a huge gamble at the time, but I decided to enroll in that, and then took Adam's year-long horary course, which is where I learned enough astrology to start doing it for people. And I really loved that class. I would imagine that a lot of people listening to you and probably listening to us talk are already pretty interested in horary as a branch of astrology. And if you want to learn to do it, Adam's class is something I just couldn't possibly overstate how effective that class was for me in teaching me this practice. And so that is grounded in traditional, I should have said this, Hawk was teaching me Hellenistic astrology, that is the tradition that I am grounded in. And Adam's teaching is also grounded in, but there is a very important direct, in person, or maybe just by email and call, but one-to-one relationship with John Frawley, the English horary master, whose textbook was sort of the main text in the course. So it's sort of like post-Lily neo-traditional horary stuff that I learned from this class. And finished that class, started doing charts. I've done 86 charts at press time in my formal practice. And in the last couple months, started studying electional astrology with the great Kira Ryberg, known for her work on the lots, zodiacal releasing. She's written about elections before. She's just one of those greats that we know that we're going to, be like just at her feet in 40 years, like as one of the great, like like historic astrologers. And she graced me with her, like with a generous offer to teach me electional astrology privately as a sort of way of jump starting what I hope very soon will be a course that other people can also take. And interestingly, that was the introduction to the sort of older Islamic texts, which I know are sort of your favorite part of the tradition. That's where I started to, I'd read bits and pieces in the course of learning with Adam, and also some of the historical overview type stuff that like Chris Brennan and Ben Dykes and other like contemporary people who are not only astrologers but historians of astrology sort of refer to from that tradition. But the first time reading Saul and Mashallah and all those, like, you know, great people from hundreds of years before, the tradition that I had studied in was in Kira's homework for elections. And so what I'm doing, and I just yesterday, actually, at the time we're recording this, passed my final exam and launched elections as one of my offerings. And what I feel like I'm working on now is sort of picking apart a lot of the philosophical astrological questions in that tradition about what charts are, what moments are, what questions are, what inceptions are, what elections are, what conceptions are. And while I do feel like I practice multiple kinds of astrology and that like electional, I might change to whole sign houses to do elections, whereas I'm using Placidus houses to do horary questions. But so there's different procedures, right? But I really feel like starting with horary taught me to look at a chart a certain way, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And like significated planets signifying topics and interacting in a sort of narrative way, and finding so much overlap with what I learned there in electional. And in fact, the kind of stuff that confuses me is really interesting. It's like when I messed up an electional chart in my homework, what I had done was describe the situation realistically, exactly as I would expect it to go, which is what a horary chart would do, right? It would have all the bad stuff in it, and it would just be like, that's the nature of weddings. Weddings are going to have problems. Like that's so like, of course, it's okay that there's like a seventh house problem here. Like there's going to be seventh house problems. It's marriage. What are you going to do? And it really took some work to be like, no, that's not what electional is for. It's for choosing the ultimate possible wedding and trying to make it as great as you can.
It's about like optimization rather than being like, you asked me a question, I'm going to tell you the answer because this chart is telling me the answer.
Yeah.
Like it's interpretation, or it's choosing rather than interpretation.
Totally. And you like have the freedom to do that instead of just sort of finding out what fate's got in store for you. So basically, like the stuff that's really interesting to me about astrology now is kind of philosophical in nature. Like astrology is sort of astrology to me. It works however you need it to work for whatever you're trying to do. The question is, what are you trying to do? And like when you're trying to do those things, figure out the answers to these things, or predict this kind of thing, or decide for on the best moment of action for something. Like, what are the considerations that change based on what that is? And so I consider astrology to be a very powerful, like a human superpower that must be used for good and can be used for ill. And so, that's what I love to talk about as much as I love to talk about planets and signs,
Yeah, absolutely.
At the end of the day, it's like we have been given this gift that is extremely potent, and what can we do with it?
Yeah. And I'm a Sag rising, but I have a strong Saturn as well, your Cap rising, like with what's the saying? With like rights come responsibilities, for
with
lack
great
of
power.
With being able to look into the seams of fate, we have to steward that well. Yeah,
it's a lot of responsibility sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess I should have known how perfect this conversation would all kind of weave together with other things that I'm doing in Leo season, because I just recorded an episode with Kira on the Lot of Fortune, and that was inspired actually. And I don't think you know this, but I've kind of moved from doing just 2 episodes a month about the moon as the sect light and out of sect to doing like some other topical stuff about the moon during this moon season. And that's kind of been inspired by your podcast and by like these kind of short episodes that you're doing, these like short very topically focused episodes that you're doing. And I was just like, I kind of want to do that too and explore topics that I'm curious about in a way that's kind of more manageable, more digestible for people. So yeah, I'm not sure if Kira's episode will have launched by the time this is launched, or if it will be a little after. And then also, I said Wei was on the previous Leo Moon episode, but Hawk is also on that episode.
The whole crew.
And it's like, I say I should have known because like we all know each other from kind of Twitter and social media and stuff, but we're all just like on a kind of group chat together as well, where we talk about astrology and spirituality and life. And occasionally, like, you know, I posted a horary chart that I did, and we do horary in very different ways. But you know, I was like, you took a look at it, you gave me your thoughts on it, which I found really helpful. And I think that having that kind of community can be so supportive in the journey of learning astrology and, you know, and kind of like finding your way on this path. And one of the things that's really interesting to me that you kind of brought up is, I don't know if you're referring to this, but I think the how of astrology is still, the how or the why is still really interesting to me, because I think about, for example, like the way that you practice horary and the way that I practice horary, and they're different enough that someone could be like, I don't understand how these can both work. Yet somehow, because the nature of time or the cosmos or what have you is so kind of fractal and kaleidoscopic, and because astrology has this mercurial nature of being dual, somehow it can work for you and it can work for me at the same time, or, you know, in a parallel way. And it kind of blows my mind a little bit when it's just like, one, how can horary work in general when it's like, why does asking a question, like, why does that exchange between a querent and the astrologer, how can the chart of the moment say something about a question? And then, you know, how can that be tailored to the practitioner as well? You know, it's fascinating. I don't necessarily have an answer. I'm kind of in a place of just like feeling wonder about it, which is its own kind of education, I think, its own kind of benefit. But yeah, it's really, really interesting.
The one step I skipped in the story of how I ended up studying horary was that I was put onto the book The Moment of Astrology by Jeffrey Cornelius, which amazing. Is where sort of all of my answers to those kinds of questions came from. And that chart is, I mean, that book is full of crazy chart examples where like the wrong chart, still like a chart that was sort of like randomly generated by some magazine editor, like still produced a correct answer. And like some researcher, you know, found a chart from a medical textbook hundreds of years ago that was like totally radical to the chart that he had just cast and used it to find the answer and all this stuff. And like I've already had 86 charts, is like not none, but it's not a ton either. And like I've already had all kinds of crazy connections between like multiple horaries, or like certain ones that went a certain way, said something was going to happen. Consideration before judgment says the querent's not going to listen to me, and then they totally do the opposite of exactly what I said. Like, you know, it's like the answer that I took from that book, really, but then immediately found to be true in practice, is just that the practitioner, the divination is a human practice. It's a human superpower, like I said. And like what that means is that the human being is the medium. That's why the word medium is used in like other forms of divination. And I sort of encourage us all to use it, or to think of ourselves that way, not just as technicians, you know, determining an answer from a set of mechanistic rules, but as like a critical ingredient in the transmission of whatever the universe has to say about the situation and the situation itself, which we're in as the astrologer. That's why the considerations before judgment can show the astrologer in the chart. Like that, right. We're part of it. And them coming to us, the querent coming to us and saying, I have this question, is this like engagement with the divine, who is someone or someone's with whom we are supposed to be in constant relationship. So that when somebody comes to us, the gods, if you will, which I don't usually, but I will because this is an astrology podcast, the gods hear about it from us. And so that moment is incredibly significant. It's the birth of something. You know, one of the cool things that I've been reading about in these electional texts is the question of whether you can use a question chart or, you know, the chart for the consultation, which in some ways is the same thing, to root an election. Where if you don't know the querent's birth time, which in a lot of societies and in a lot of times in history has been the case more often than not, and even today still, but you get a question that's like, will my business be successful? And the chart is incredibly radical and says that it will. That means, like, it implies, you know, according to the sort of philosophy of astrology, that chart for that question or that consultation must be radical to the nativity of this person, because if their natal promise shows that they're going to have a successful business, then that's what the chart is going to say. So therefore, if the question chart is radical to the nativity, then you can use that to root an election for when to launch the business later, even if you don't have a nativity. Because that moment of coming to an astrologer is such a significant moment in that person's life that it must root to their nativity, even if we don't know it.
Yeah, in Saul's introduction, or perhaps it's the first chapter of On Questions, he talks about, and now he's talking about 9th century Baghdad, let's say, I might be wrong about that, but around that area. And he's saying if someone doesn't have a birth chart, because as you said, many people don't, if they come to you and ask a horary, ask you what their life will be for the rest of their life, you can cast a chart for the moment. You can cast a horary chart that can be an alternative birth chart for that person, which is kind of wild to me that that's a thing that may have been done. And yeah, Saul just kind of mentions it. And it's really interesting you bring up this idea of, like, you know, I've heard, I think Sue Ward talk about this in her conversation with Chris Brennan on the considerations before judgment. And then I've seen it show up in my own horary client practice where people will be like, is this horary chart supposed to overlap with my birth chart? Because it does.
All the time. Yes. I'll get people with the exact same, with their like natal ascendant on the ascendant all the time. You know, it's just like, it's often just very silly, or like, that's the rule or my annual perfection. And like, you know, that it's like, this is just literally what's happening to it in transits right now. And, you know, I see how it's connected. It's just a point of view at the end of the day, right? It's like you're taking a point of view into the situation, which is more complex than we could possibly fathom. And you're taking one slice of time from one location and getting a sideways look at it. I'm not sure I would use a radical consultation chart about a business as a natal chart for that person for something else. But, you know, I would certainly continue to use that chart in further elections or, you know, solar revolutions about the business or whatever, you know, like that moment is going to be important forever for that venture.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we could talk about this for probably another hour.
Could, but we should talk about the moon, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's pivot a little bit. And one thing I'm interested in, you were raised Jewish. I've had a few guests on the show that are Muslim, and they talked about the importance of the moon in Islam. And I was raised Catholic, and there's no focus on the moon in Catholicism, really. But I'm not so sure about Judaism. And I was curious if you could share a little bit about that. And then also just like, tell us a little bit about your relationship to the moon in your childhood. Is there anything did you have a relationship? Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of like a striking memory from childhood in relation to her?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what my answer was going to be, is that it's part of Jewish life and practice. The Jewish and Islamic calendars are different, but they do share an important feature, which is that the new month is not like counted until the moon is visible again. So the sort of typical astrological dark moon, the conjunction, is not what Muslims or Jews use to count the month. So technically and this is where they diverge completely. Like these are the kinds of things that just are totally down to like local historical circumstance. But the rabbinic tradition for counting the month in Judaism is when the month begins the night that the crescent moon is first visible from Jerusalem. So it's not the same everywhere. And this lens, I mean, so that is where we render the calendar from. Whenever that night is when the first month is for the whole world. But this leads to all kinds of complex calendar problems. Basically, like one of the most notorious is that holidays, generally speaking, in the world outside of the Holy Land are held for 2 days rather than one, in order to catch that day in places that are so far from Jerusalem that
right.
the timing of the moon rise is and the emergence from the beams of the sun is right.
That seems
So
oddly astrological to
it's super astrological.
The location of Jerusalem and this certain like showing of the crescent of the moon.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's more like foundational stuff about how the moon is used in Judaism, because the Torah uses the moon to time the festival. So like the major festivals are all on full moons, which is an absolutely sensible night to have a festival, because it's the one where you have the most light to hang out outside at night. And so these are sort of the two major moon. The months are rendered in the Torah, like they're named and they're given back. They're not the names that we use now, but the names that we use now are the Babylonian names for the months. So like this is all just the way the world worked at the time.
Right.
Like it's inherited from the same peoples and traditions that the astrological tradition is inherited from. It's just like the way that you kept time on a monthly basis in that time of history. And so of course it's built in as the way that we keep time on that scale. But yeah, that's what I grew up doing. Like I knew about the moon phase because of that. Like there's two uses of the moon really in this sort of like biblical structure of time. There's the full moons when the festivals are, and there's the new moons when the months start. And so you do different things in different months based on what holidays fall in those months, and sometimes what sort of annual readings of the Torah portion fall in those months. The month is very well understood because like that's the ritual cycle. So what all the things are that happen in each given month. But the deeper you dig, the more like traditional astrological significations for what those things are you find. And there's one major difference between the Islamic and Jewish calendars is that the Jewish calendar is synced to compensates to sync with the solar calendar. So there is a leap month that is inserted every few years, and where that is inserted is in the spring, so that you can end up with the equinox being in between the two full moons that you need for the two spring festivals. So the springtime is taken as the beginning of the year, just like we would astrologically. And like, in certain texts, the, constellations are mentioned, or, even just like the association between the solstices and equinoxes and the signs. So like not even necessarily the constellations, but the tropical zodiac, right? And, there's a lot of stuff. People raised Christian know this. There's a lot of stuff in the Hebrew Bible that makes it sound, if you translate it into English with the right set of cultural biases, like divination is not allowed and astrology is not, and actually it's never really clear that it's talking about astrology. But there are a fair number of later rabbinic texts that explicitly say like Jewish people are not subject to astrology or whatever. And like those things get handed down as being what sort of mainstream rationalist Orthodox Jews believe, but not all Orthodox Jews are rationalists and not all Orthodox Jews believe that. And there's just like a lot of avoidance of this topic in Jewish culture. And like, I always am able to just completely stop the show if I run into somebody who gives me, Judaism crap for practicing astrology, because I mean, frankly, one of the greatest scholars in the history of exile Judaism Reb Avraham Ibn Ezra, who's a
Mm-hmm.
name all astrologers know.
Yeah.
Like it was a prolific translator of Arabic astrological texts into Hebrew, wrote his own Hebrew language astrological primers and texts. And like, I think people in the traditional astrology world understand that this is a Jewish guy with the title of rabbi who wrote a lot of astrology books. I don't know that everybody necessarily understands that he's probably the foremost Torah commentator. Like his commentary on the Torah is like taught to every kid. So like it's not just like some guy who did astrology. It's like there was a period of time when these civilizations, these sort of Persian and Arab and Jewish and Hellenistic civilizations were all in contact with each other and intermingling with each other in a cosmopolitan era of history, kind of like ours, where like this was just the kind of thing, like there's zodiacs painted on the ceilings of synagogues all over the Mediterranean from like the right period, you know? And it's just because it's like not culturally what we do at certain times of history doesn't mean it wasn't completely pervasive in the Jewish world at other times. Anyway, this wasn't about my childhood at all. This was about the entire history of my people. But that's why the moon played a role in my life as a child. But like that isn't all it was to me. It was also a place where you go in a spaceship with a helmet on, and like, you know, that was my relationship to outer space. That's let me put it this way. That's what I thought my relationship to outer space was about as a boy, was like exploration of the physical world. But obviously that was just a lens I had for interpreting what were really like very deep yearnings for these places and those bodies and this solar system and its motions. So it really was everything. I was as obsessed with Neptune and Pluto as I was with the moon. You know, it wasn't just about the moon, but seeing the moon in the sky all the time was a way that I wouldn't say I was like rigorous. I mean, we weren't like a super religious household. I wasn't like rigorously tracking the phases of the moon yet, but I was certainly aware of what moon phase like a holiday was on. And it had those associations for me. So yeah, it goes all the way back. I'm not sure I can point to a single memory because you know, like I knew when the full moon was, you know, it's just like, it was just part of my, it was as meaningful to me as the Gregorian calendar was.
Right. Yeah.
If not more.
So when you were a kid, you like wanted to be an astronaut when you grew up?
Yeah, pretty much. That was one of the several things I wanted to be.
Yeah. That's super cool.
I don't want to be an astronaut anymore. I quite like the Earth now. I would rather stay here.
I mean, I feel like we don't have to get into it, but there's so many class connotations with space travel these days that it's like, anyway, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk a little bit about what the moon means to you today and why you think the moon is important in an astrological practice. Yeah.
It's hard to overstate, isn't it? Like the moon is the so somebody said something to me, I can't remember what it was, on the internet the other day, but the reply I needed to make, which was taken as a joke, but I was also completely serious, is the moon is always conjunct Earth. Like that's the thing that the moon has in that no one else has, is like it's with us. It's you know, it's often ascribed, you know, associations with the body or the emotions, or, you know, there are all these things that people sort of put on the moon that actually sometimes to me feel like they serve to distance themselves from what it actually means, which is like, this is us, it's here. This is actually the Jewish way of talking about it, is like the sun and the moon. You know, Judaism theologically makes a lot of the number one, as you may have heard. And so like the you know, the sun is sort of the center of what's happening, and it's not super mysterious what that's supposed to represent theologically. But then like, what is the moon? The moon is the people. The moon receives the light. And so like that is actually you know, fairly good mundane astrological delineation for what the moon represents. It represents us, right? And so, and in the kind of astrology that you and I practice on a day-to-day basis, you know, the moon has an interesting, like, sort of shifting set of significations, but really like is supposed to represent the querent, the person approaching the oracle with their question. And sometimes it does so on like a more symbolic level, let's say, you know what I mean? Like in a chart, which is a lot of charts, I find, where the ruler of the ascendant, the planet ruling the ascendant, is clearly like that person looking at them almost objectively in the situation, and the aspect that planet is separating and the one that it's making is like, what's happening to them in a fairly linear way. But then the moon and typically the moon and sun sort of interact on a deeper level that shows something more poetic about what's happening. That and also, like, if there's an immediate aspect, particularly harmonious aspect forming between the sun and moon, it's sort of like the cheat code for the question, right? It's like if the lights are in harmony, then like then this is going to work out okay.
Yeah.
And so then that's not always true, and one of the reasons it's not always true is that these are also both characters in the story, and sometimes the Leo house or the Cancer house is super important and represents some specific person, and you got to look at it a different way. But that's sort of the interesting thing about the moon, right? Is that the moon kind of takes it all on and takes on different things at different times. And it illustrates the principle of phase better than anything else, because we see its phase in the sky. We sort of can almost, I mean, the thing I was saying about holidays in the full moon, it's like, there is you don't have to use your rational mind to derive a lot of meaning from the moon's current condition, because if it's like fully illuminated in the sky at night, that's a very different feeling that you're going to have that night than on a night where you don't see it at all. And so it's sort of there to teach us about the waxing and waning cycles of orbiting celestial bodies. But there's one more thing I want to say about it, which I believe is also attributable to Sue Ward, and maybe even the same podcast. Maybe not, but it was definitely Sue Ward. She used the word a modem to describe the moon. And that really changed, as funny and like technological metaphor that is, that really changed the way that I relate to the moon and the way that I delineate the moon. I think maybe because I was sort of expecting Mercury to do the modem job. But the Mercury is like the sun's modem. It's a different, it's a different thing. The moon is the Earth's modem. And what it does is move around the circle really fast, making contact with everybody one at a time, and bringing down the significations of where those larger, farther, longer traveling bodies are, and communicating them to us. And so that's sort of what cracked the third house for me, right? Like the third house, the moon's place, being the place of communication and familiarity, particularly, like that job that the moon does of like communicating or translating, if you will, the light between the rest of the planets and us, is sort of what I say thank you to her for every day and in every chart.
Tal, you're an interesting guest, because I think that you're the only guest I've had that doesn't have a natal practice. Is that correct? You don't have a natal practice, right?
I don't offer natal astrology readings to people in a formal way. That is true.
That's a better way of framing it. That's more of what I meant. But you do offer electional and horary. And I just think that's really interesting. And I'm curious if there's anything more that you can say now that you're offering electional about the moon's role and condition in electional astrology.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's funny that you say that I don't have a natal practice, even just in that sense of in my formal practice, because now, of course, that I am doing elections, I secretly do, because I have to collect natal chart data to do the elections. So like I'm backing into having natal charts for my clients, and that will,
because radicality, radix, this concept in astrology, it's interesting how different it can be in horary with like the actual chart being rooted in the question. And then like with electional, it's like the electional chart needs to be chosen to root to to kind of go together with other charts.
Yeah. I feel like there is a bottom end of elections. I haven't really figured out what to do about this yet, because I am charging an amount of money for an election, even just for one person, where not everybody's going to be able to afford that. And so I'm sort of thinking about ways of editing my horary offering to be like, if your question is just, when should I get my next haircut? Maybe you don't need to, like, if it's a haircut for your brother's wedding, that's one thing. But like, if it's just like if you just want to know when a good time to do something was, like, maybe we can just use a horary chart for that. And like, I'll just like take a look at what the horary says and then find an election that roots to that will make the best of whatever your situation is. And we can leave it at that, right? But like if you're electing like when to launch your business, you don't want to do that in a way that's going to even accidentally conflict with the sort of destiny that you were promised, right?
The natal promise. Yeah.
So the moon, though, as important as the moon is in horary, which I kind of already talked about, right? It's like it's supposed to be the querent unless sort of proven otherwise, or if your dog ran away, then it's probably the dog. But otherwise, the moon is, it sticks out in the horary chart because it's moving so fast. It's often like, moon aspects are sort of the only thing that I will, that it's not the only thing, but like moon aspects are something I will frequently brush aside, or at least like leave aside for a moment, if like two slower planets are connecting, but the moon is sort of modeming its way through there first. You know what I mean? Like its speed almost like makes it too busy for the use in a horary chart. But in an election, you're kind of doing the opposite thing in an electional chart from what you're doing in a horary chart, right? For a horary chart, you're taking a single moment and you're playing it out as a bunch of, as like a story over time. So so these like minute things, it is kind of the same, I guess. In an election, you're choosing a single moment, and that single moment needs to encapsulate everything that will occur, like to the thing that you're basically creating a natal chart for that thing. I'm backing into having a natal practice in multiple ways. But the texts all say the condition of the moon is like absolutely the non-negotiable thing. And I might say the condition of the moon and the condition of the ascendant ruler are the two things that are non-negotiable. And that does sound a lot like the thing I just said about horary, but it's like I do look at them slightly differently. The ruler of the ascendant is definitely the person for whom you are electing the thing. The moon is not just the person, it's the whole thing, right? So you can't have the moon in a dark house. You don't want the moon like in a weak phase. You want the moon, you don't want a full moon, because then the sun and moon are at opposite purposes with each other.
Right.
You don't, but the most important thing and the hardest thing to elect, I find, is the moon's last and next aspects. And there's other things you can do with the moon. The syzygy prior to the election matters just like it would in a natal chart. The eclipse cycle before or after. Like there are all kinds of ways that you want to look out for the moon. But really what I feel like it comes down to in picking a good election is the moon's last aspect being good, at least okay, and the moon's next aspect definitely being good, please. And so a lot of what I've done, I haven't done that many. I've only done 7 or 8 different electional charts, like in I'm really doing it this time way, and one for client so far, for a friend who understood that I wasn't yet ready to go and took the risk on me anyway. The thing I tend to do is look for benefic enclosures of the moon, right? Like that's just like an easy win. Like if you can get the moon between Venus and Jupiter, like everything else will probably shake itself out, as long as there's no like glowering malefic somewhere else nearby, or with a view. It's the there are, the texts are very specific. They give a lot of examples of kinds of things to elect, and they will give you signs that it's good to have the moon in. Like I guess your sort of basic electional principles are like Cancer or Taurus would be good, but that's not always the case. Like it's not always the case that you want a fixed moon. Like the modality is at least as important in some cases. So a Taurus moon wouldn't be that great, or like you don't want an algal moon. You don't want like a 20, 26, 28 Taurus moon for a lot of stuff. So there's always complicating factors in every single thing. But like I had to do a wedding election as the sort of final exam, and weddings are super hard because you have to root to 2 charts, right? And that's why electing for 2 people is exponentially harder than electing for 1 person. But the texts were saying that Libra moons are the best for weddings. Which makes a certain sense. Venus ruled moon, cardinal moon like that, the launching of a venture. Diurnal, I don't know. It's just like you can sort of see why that would be. But it's really hard to get everything working out when the moon is only in like one of two or three signs. So the moon becomes really, really tricky in an election, and there are a lot of sort of backup plans in case it doesn't work out quite right. It's like, at least get it in a good house, at least get it applying to a malefic if you can't get it in between both of them. Maybe like if you can't help it, if you can't help the moon, help its ruler. Like there's you have to take care of the moon. That's sort of the bottom line is for an election, is like there may be other things happening. You are trying to set up a certain relationship between certain significators, but if you don't take care of the moon, it's a bust. I got a lot of homework questions wrong because I didn't take enough care of the moon. Even if like there's a beautiful trine between the two significators you want to see and they're in great houses, the moon not being in a great house, even if it is okay dignity wise, like that's enough to turn it over, because like because what you're electing with the moon is what happens to this venture. So applying to the benefic of Sect would be really nice for just about anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who are listening and they're like, wow, it sounds like horary and electional seem kind of similar. Even though they're different branches of astrology, horary is an outgrowth, more or less, of electional astrology. Which is an older, electional is a few centuries older than horary. So a lot of the principles of electional astrology are kind of imported or used in horary to answer questions. Just want to make that clear. All right, the sign of Leo. What does the sign of Leo mean to you? And did you want to talk about myth at all, or?
As much as that is impossible to avoid in astrology, that's not really my lens for it.
I want to hear it.
I don't. Well, first of all, culturally speaking, a lot of the mythology is like not my people, not my pantheon, people who destroyed the temple of my people. Like it's just like not a cultural repertoire in which I partake that much. The like Hellenistic myths and gods. I do, of course,
which is important. An important thing I think to consider when doing astrology, that there is a colonial element to it. And how do we navigate that, and how do we interact with that, especially when our own cultural heritage intersects with that, or what have you?
Yeah. So that being said, I do, of course, have a deeply mythological relationship with the Torah and the Hebrew Bible and the stories of my own tradition. But those stories aren't really usually, let's say, astrologically oriented myths. They're usually sort of family history type of things. And the spirituality of them, while very vivid and often very revelatory and divinatory in nature, is kind of just coming from somewhere else. It's not really coming from the playing out of the dramas in the heavens. So I'm not sure if this is directly connected or not, but I really do tend to draw the narrative component of my astrological delineations directly from the astronomy, which of course is what they did in the first place, right? Like, that's why these myths are so compellingly associated with these planetary bodies and parts of the sky, is because they watched their behavior and they derived the sort of mythological relationship to it from its actual movements. And so that's what I tend to like dig into like if I find out about a new body that people are using in astrology, like the centaurs, which I have a little bit of a fascination with that I don't know what I will do with yet. The first thing I tend to do is be like, how big is it? What is it made of? What is its orbital period? I mean, that's the obvious one, right? It's like, how long does it take to go around the zodiac?
Right.
But also like finding out that, it has like a crazy declining orbit that's not in the plane of the solar system. Like, I want to know about that. That tells me a lot about who that being is. And I do relate, this is important to say, I do relate to them as beings with minds and souls and hearts and voices. So it's not like I'm not relating to these planetary bodies and places, which they are both things and places, as beings with whom I'm in relationship and can tell a story about. It's just that I tend to derive the story from what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And the, I didn't mention this at the beginning when I said I was obsessed with Pluto and Neptune when I was a kid, but I'm of the cohort that was born in the years when Pluto was in Scorpio, and that's the sort of part of the sky where it comes in closer to the Earth than Neptune, in like absolute, not Earth, sun, closer to the sun in absolute distance. And like Pluto's closer to the Earth than Neptune, and Pluto was still a planet also when I was a child. Thank you very much. And like, that I was amazed by that. I was like, they told us there were 9 planets and they were in concentric circles, but actually there's something much more complicated than that going on.
Right. Yeah.
And that figures very heavily. I have Pluto, born with Pluto bang on the MC. Like I'm looking up at Pluto all of the time. Yeah. And like that fact figures very heavily into my understanding of who that is. So that's the sort of answer to like, what's my relationship with mythology and with, there's another part of the answer though. Like if you're asking about the signs and like what the sort of story of the year is, that comes from the seasonality of it to me. Like I don't think that there's a person on this earth, except maybe in like super tropical places where the weather's the same all the time, that doesn't have like a mythological relationship with the seasons, right? And maybe it's not super detailed in terms of the imaginal part, but like I know what the spring equinox feels like.
Right.
And so I do the first thing I learned, I would say, about tropical astrology was what modality means.
Right.
And I have 2 fixed angles and I have this Leo stellium. So I have a lot of fixed stuff going on. And I relate to that very much. That was always very obvious to me. There's a lot, like a lot of podcasts about what the sign of Leo means become very annoying after that question is asked, right? Because there's like a lot of very silly and almost too obvious ways of delineating Leo, because it's like a lion. It's not like, you don't need to be like a religious or poetic genius to sort of think about how cool a lion is, right? And like I knew that I was a Leo sun. I knew that was something super cool. But like what I first learned that clicked for me was that it's the middle of summer. We
kind of talked about this a little bit at the beginning.
Yes, malefic sun.
Yeah.
Like it's I mean, which is funny because it's like where the sun has dignity, but like the sun is like the season is at its peak there. And when I looked around the zodiac and I was like, oh, I see, like you have the solstices and equinoxes where everything changes. And then you have the middle of the season where it is like the sort of quintessential like nature of itself. And then you have the place where everything starts to change and like, is hot one day and cold the next day and all of that. And that was very, very clear to me what all of those things meant. And so I derive my stories of the signs from the solar year, from the seasons, but also, and then combine that with their planetary rulers and their natures, which I can say a lot about, and also has to do with that sort of their speed and their period and their fate, and like all the astronomical stuff that I was talking about before. You combine those things and you get a very interesting story about a place. And but that's the thing about the traditional dignity scheme, right? It's just like it all fits together beautifully, and it is like whichever piece you're using to look at it will sort of explicate something about the other pieces. So I guess that's all a way of saying, like, I don't really need to use the constellations or the sort of mythological stories about these places, because they all make like basically intuitive sense to me.
Yeah.
Because of how the sky works.
Yeah, You're not the first guest that's kind of pushed back on this a little bit, and I think it's probably because of sun sign astrology, and like how things that aren't psychological can get kind of psychologized.
Yeah.
I really like this question though, because I like, so there was this activity that I did in Jason Holly's a class I took with him, which was like a series on the earth signs. And so what he had us do to kind of like do this kind of like astro drama almost was to lay on the floor and to imagine what the environment of a particular sign felt like, and to picture yourself there amidst that environment. And I found that incredibly enriching because, and I've actually gone back to that a lot this year. I'm in this Virgo perfection year. And I've, by a twist of fate, basically, I ended up doing a consultation with Freedom Cole where he gave me this Virgo mantra to do because Mercury is my, what's called my Atmakarika. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And so I had a lot, like in that class with Jason, I imagined being at the end of Leo and what that felt like. And it felt almost volcanic. It was very rocky and hard and hot. And I imagine myself kind of walking into Virgo, and what does Virgo feel like? And it's kind of like, it's like a vineyard almost. It's that harvest element of the seasonality as well as Mercury's associations with commerce. And I feel like that's perhaps part of why Mercury is exalted there, because it's like, separating the wheat from the chaff, what gets sold, like what's saleable, what's disposable in terms of like our crop that we've grown. And doing my mantra, I imagined that place. I imagined Mercury in that place doing that work. And I think that that's so helpful to do because, the dignity scheme is how it is because of the nature of the planet. It is how it is for a lot of reasons, but part of it is the nature of the planet and the nature of environment and how those things intersect with the element, with the modality, with all of this. And so it's like Jupiter doesn't really, like Mercury's in its element doing the harvesting and separating the good crops from the crops that can't be sold. Jupiter doesn't really want to do that, perhaps. Like Jupiter maybe can do that. It's not necessarily what it wants to do. And I think that speaks to kind of Jupiter in Virgo. And I don't have that needle placement, so maybe I shouldn't speak to it too much. But anyway, I just wanted to share that for people as like an activity that they can do. Literally imagine what the sign feels like. What is the beginning of Leo feel like? What is the end of Leo feel like? Because the bounds and the terms and the dodecatemoria and all of these divisions are going to give each place its own little kind of feel from the others.
Yeah, the end of Leo and the beginning of Virgo are places that are very familiar to me natally, and it's also just like the time that the high holidays tend to happen in the Jewish calendar, and so it's particularly Virgo season. I think about those places a lot. The moon I have in the second decan of Leo in Saturn's bound in the sort of middle of summer. And, as anybody with a little bit of chart brain has figured out by now, that means I have a very balsamic moon. It's let me see, I'm doing math. It's 18 degrees. So it's like the last chance, and this, it's a lot of your questions about sort of how the natal moon phase, plays out for me. I've been pretty surprised by how, as I've thought about when we start to do astrology, we start to think about the patterns of these cycles and phases in like much more intricate ways than we may need to otherwise when we're just sort of living in an environment and looking at the sky from time to time. One thing that I've always been fascinated about the moon's phase is its relationship to the sect of the chart at any given time when it's above or below the horizon. And having a very late moon like I have, you see that moon just before dawn. And that is the only time you see it. And that is a time, that's when I wake up every day. That's when I want to be awake. And I really deeply connect these two things. And you know, in the sky when I was born, the moon was not visible, but it was also close to the one that wasn't. It was like it's in the by quadrant house. It's in the seventh house, so it's setting. It's about 30 degrees from the actual descendant degree. Which so the moon rules my descendant also. That's something worth thinking about. It's like the moon really represents sort of other people and relationships to me. And the really interesting thing about this wake up pattern being sort of related to when the moon was the Sect light on the day I was born and visible in the sky is that that's before everybody else wakes up. And so I have this like almost combust moon ruling the place of other people, and the thing I really need in order to sort of have you know, the word energy is so overused, but in order to have the energy I need for a given day of like encounters and activities, and being the Leo sun person that I'm supposed to be, I need to get up before everybody else first and sort of prepare myself in the dark. And I really just, that all just beautifully describes the phase of the moon I was born in to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're reminding me of something I was thinking about on my walk before our conversation. I was thinking about your moon phase because we have a similar moon phase. I also have a balsamic moon, but it's about 30 degrees away. We both have a fire moon. And so I was thinking about Gray's Gray's lecture that he did at NORWAC, where he talks about kind of like moon phase in relation to the element where the moon is. The difference between our charts is that I have the sun in Capricorn, you have the sun in Leo. And so I was thinking about kind of an extension of the concept that he was talking about of, and this kind of idea of the moon reflecting the light of the sun. I was reminded of Ali Alomi's podcast episode about the moon and this kind of assertion that the moon also lets out its own light, which is like an idea I really like, but I do think obviously it also reflects the light of the sun. And so the place where the sun is going to determine kind of the quality of light that can be reflected. Because obviously the sun is very different in Capricorn than it is in Leo. And so I just found that a really interesting idea that I've been thinking about. So I'm curious for you, how like the moon in a fixed fire sign, how you experience that in relation to this phase, which is kind of very waning, perhaps, like if you want to psychologize it, it's more internal. There's a spirit, like people give a spiritual element to the balsamic moon. Wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, it's hard not to completely chart dox myself in order to do so, but it's also, you know, I'm capable of magically protecting myself. So go, you know, whatever. The way that I relate to that sign, that very busy sign of Leo, is not in isolation. I have really a grand trine of activity between all three fire signs. And as a Capricorn rising, that means my 4th house and my 12th house are both engaged with this 8th house activity, which is, you know, as much as so much of that stuff involves other people, 2 very private and intimate places are involved. And my 12th house is where Saturn is. My chart ruler is in the 12th. And in the 4th, I have Jupiter stationed at the 29th degree. So like I have an overcoming trine from my 4th house Jupiter I have a Venus Cazimi at the 29th degree of Leo. And so there's like this very deep connection between the 4th house, like the innermost place, and like anything visible. Jupiter is also stationed, and so it's like retrograde. So like I have like, it's related to the thing I said about the moon and needing to charge up first. Like I have a very deep abiding need to recharge. Fire is a huge element in my life, but I spend a lot of time by the fireplace in my house. That's sort of like what I need. Like it's almost like I'm a steam engine where I need to like build up a huge like internal fire in order to go out and be this person. And so there's that connection. And then the other thing, there's a question on your list about like, are there any other aspects the moon makes in your chart that would be important to discuss? Why, yes, there would. The moon's next aspect is with this Saturn. It's a trine across to my 12th house Saturn. And that is, it's not what I would elect for me necessarily, but it is the ruler of the ascendant, right? It's like it's not like, and Saturn is rejoicing in the 12th. It's not like a particularly bad off Saturn or a particularly wicked one. It's also in Sect, right? Like it's me, but like I need this like little dark lamp like with me in order to show up in a Capricorn way and like operate in the world. So that's sort of the image for me, is like the Saturn, the Sag Saturn, Capricorn rising is like, it like reminds me of my personality in a lot of ways. But without like sort of carrying that little moon lantern with me, I'm not going to see where I'm going at all.
I love that metaphor and the idea of the moon as like an activator, activating what it touches, and like literally, like being that kind of resource for you. And it's also interesting, you talked about like sitting by the fireplace, and I do think of the hearth as like a metaphor for Leo. And Diana Rose Harper talks about like these different images around the elements in the different modalities. And I have this Sagittarius moon, and you can think about like, what is mutable fire? It's a fire that you can carry, or it's a wildfire. Whereas, people talk about Aries as like the flamethrower or the spark, that cardinal. But I do think about Leo as like the hearth, the fireplace in your home that you stoke, that you gather around. And it's just reminding me of kind of like all the domestic work. I don't know if that's a great way of framing it, but it's like you being a resource to your family and to your partner, like in the home, all these things that you're doing, waking up before dawn to feed the chickens and do all these things. That feels kind of apropos and poignant.
Yeah, I mean, and that's like it's my work, right? Like I it's interesting. I have had job like career for a lot of my adult life, but it has still always been of service to something greater. Like I've never worked in a kind of work where just like making money or like working for a company that sells a thing in a straightforward way. Like that's never been my work. It's always been work that is in service to something. And so something I gradually figured out is like, I was really just sort of approximating and like working my way towards the kind of, literal like eighth house service to my home and family that I am increasingly having now. And like, being a rabbi's husband has a lot of those sorts of duties. But it's also like what I write about and what work I do online, and what even sort of who I do astrology for is like that sort of householder everyday stuff. I think that's sort of why I like horary so much, is that like, where did my kids' bunny doll go? Is like a question that I have a lot of the time. And that is really an amazing thing to use this human superpower that we've been discussing for, is to just help people get through their days. And that's sort of what I spend my time doing, is helping the people around me get through their days. And I get my help for getting through my days from them to some extent, but I also have a fair number of planetary beings I can call upon to help me if I need a little extra, and so I try to facilitate that for other people too. Yeah. It's very eighth house life, and the the dark and negative connotations of the eighth house don't bother me. Maybe this is the Pluto MC thing and the Capricorn rising thing. Like I'm very comfortable with the idea of things ending and changing. And I just try, sounds like a Capricorn rising speaking. I just try to be ready for them. That's all we've got is just,
right.
That's what astrology's for, right? Look around the corner so you can be ready for whatever's coming.
Yeah, to speak or to allude to our friend Daniel Norman, it's ever happening. Astrology is, the sky is always turning. And I will say, as a Sag rising with Jupiter and Cancer in the eighth house, I can definitely relate. I've been talking about this a lot. Just, how much of life is about, the duality of life and death, and the duality of starts and finishes, and all of these things, like the death is in the seed kind of thing, and vice versa. So I can absolutely relate to that. And I know that we're running out of time, and so I do want to move on. Thank you very much for sharing everything you've been sharing. One last question I have about like the kind of astrology before we dive into the kind of moon phases and then wrap it up and whatnot is if you have any thoughts on the moon's co-presence with Leo and the kind of like resourcing that can come to the moon from that.
Yeah, just to let you know,
the moon's co-presence with the sun, I'm sorry, in Leo.
Gotcha. A lot of that to me has to do with the moon being very close to this very powerful configuration, this Venus Cazimi, but not so close that it's combust all the way. And there's the sense that it's like there's this sort of last glimmer of something before a whole new episode begins, and like I really relate to that kind of last chance feeling. It doesn't feel like it's all exhausted. It feels like there's one last move to make.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I can relate as like a fellow balsamic moon for sure. That kind of aspect of, or like awareness of time as like somehow further along, but not there yet.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so have you tracked the cycles of the moon in relation to your own life? And if so, what have you found?
Like I said, I've been sort of vaguely aware of it my whole life, and now I track it religiously, obviously. I think what I would say is more than phase, not more than phase. I don't track the moon without tracking its transits through the houses. And so like I notice its phase in relation to the house that it's in, the natal house that it's in, very closely. And so I try and orient my activities and sort of metabolism and day-to-day life around sort of which parts of my life are going to be resourced and which parts of my life are going to be tapped. And it really helps a lot. I have a publishing schedule on my website that uses the moon's transits through the stakes of my chart to time publishing of a certain kind of thing. And it's really nice because it gives me like a 2-3 day window to get the thing done. But it also, I selected all of them very carefully so that it would feel like something I would be resourced to do when the moon was in that house. But I'm in my first year of it, right? So I'm only just starting to get a sense of how the phase changing through those houses really affects the work that comes out. And I can't wait to like sort of come back on your podcast in 5 years and let you know how that's going, because I'm sure it's going to be traceable too. Because if just the moon transits alone are enough to sort of draw these things out of me, I feel like the cyclical like phase relationship of those moons in those signs is going to show something really interesting.
I hope that we can have that conversation one day.
Yeah.
All right. Any suggestions for someone new to astrology or planetary relationship in working with the moon?
I mean, I would just track the lunar month Like that's the step two would be the thing I just said, which is like if you track the moon's changes of signs and notice how that affects the topics in your life that those houses represent for you, you're going to notice things. But I think that the rhythm is really the thing to get used to. And so tracking the month, watching even just how it like wobbles around the solar calendar month, like seeing how the lunar months don't line up. They're not the same thing. They're not the same shape. They're not the same length. Like, like watch those moon phases and think of it as a complete cycle, and see what happens at each point without forcing yourself to expect anything in particular. Just notice it every day.
Yeah,
just check
observe.
it. Yeah.
Wonderful. Any parting thoughts about the moon before we go?
I just love the moon so much. I have a camera that lets me zoom in enough to really see a lot of surface detail on the moon. And I want to like recommend, if not a camera, at least a telescope to anybody, because the moon is really close. You can really see a lot of cool stuff on the surface of the moon from the ground. And that there's really nothing like it. And she's right there. Yeah. So just look up and look closely.
Absolutely. And this is a poor facsimile of that, but I will say, I've mentioned this on another episode, but you can go on Google Maps and you can go to the moon and you can like explore the different craters and their names. And I feel like they just have super cool names. And you can go to other planets as well and see like how we've named, or how scientists have named like different parts of Venus or Mars or something like that. And I just find that to be really, really cool. So
yeah, I don't know a lot of surface geology. I don't even know if you call it geology. Like I should go check that out, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I'll have to text you the link or tell you how to get it. Cause it's kind of like a little esoteric, where you have to like do a weird thing to zoom out all the way like past Earth. Anyway, Tal, where can we find you? And is there anything you're working on that you'd like to let us know about?
Well, my website is taalumot.space, TAALUMOT.space. And that same thing, TAALUMOT, is my username everywhere. I'm everywhere now. I was just on Twitter before. I'm everywhere now, except on Facebook, because why? And that's that. I do post on social media a lot, but like my website is sort of where I live. And so if you go to taalumot.space, you'll find everything I'm making, everything I'm writing, and all of the astrology that I'm doing. And, I offer horary charts on a quick turnaround. And I also, as I have said, am now offering elections for 1 or 2 people. And, happy to help.
Awesome. I'll be sure to link all that. And I just want to let people know who don't know, when you say that you post all the astrology that you're doing, you literally post a review of every horary chart you do. So there are 86 at the time of that we're recording, reviews of, the work that you've done, which I've found really, really cool to read.
There's a few fewer than that, because sometimes people withhold permission to share their results, but only 4 or 5 people have done that. So yeah, there's like 80 posts on there. And yeah, it's really important to me to write them up. It helps me get them out of my system, and like and having that as a sort of report on each chart is also super valuable. But people seem to be really learning a lot from them too, which is I'm super honored about, and we'll definitely keep working as hard as I can to make this information available instead of just hoarding it in my notes.
Wonderful. Pal, thanks so much for coming on today, being on the show. I really appreciate it.
It was an absolute pleasure.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.